Welcome to today's webinar, How the Western World Lost Its Mind on Energy. Of all the webinars we've hosted in the last year on decarbonization and change management, today's is without a doubt the most timely. Over and over again, we've been reminded that energy is the foundation of our living standard, our economy, and the promise of modernization to emerging economies in the third world. Now with what's exploded in Europe, with what has happened at the gas pump, what's threatening to all of Europe, energy security has become weaponized. Today, David Yager will be interviewed, covering 3 topics on how we got here, setting up a Q&A for you to pose your comments and questions. So without further ado, over to you, Dave.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to talk about my favorite subject. I wrote a book on this about 3 years ago. I was so confused at what was being suggested about what Alberta do. As you remember, the things were quite polarized in 2017. There was a BC election where the NDP, where Horgan was going to use every tool in the toolbox to stop the Trans Mountain Pipeline. Energy East was bogged down in regulatory reviews. Obama had canceled Keystone XL. Trudeau had canceled Northern Gateway. The LNG projects were being delayed. The industry was in the dumpster. And the advice we got from all sorts of forces was, well, why don't you just, Alberta, why don't you just do something different? Why don't you just embrace renewables? I mean, what's the big deal? So you produce a little oil. Why don't you get into wind and solar? So I wrote this book, and the title is From Miracle to Menace. And that's really my life in the oil patch. Dad started out as an accountant with an oil service company in 1949. And then all of a sudden it was a great thing that we had it. And now it's a menace. And Alberta carbon story. And the opening line is just the preface. That's what's supposed to happen when the world decarbonizes by switching away from fossil fuels. Massive economic dislocation and disruption. Did someone forget to tell you that? And so what we have really with the energy is we have the largest single politically engineered undertaking in the history of the world, where we're going to take one of the key elements of life. You got your wind, you got your food, or you got your air, you got water, food, shelter, clothing, and energy. But you say, well, we don't like the form of energy we have. We're going to do something else. And so what's happened? I tried to understand, peel back the onion. Why was this? And I wanted to answer the question for myself. So the question is the 50-year history of climate change. And what happened was over time, energy has gone from a privilege. If you turn back the clock to when my great-grandparents were sodbusters with their quarter section of land from the railroad in the late 1890s in southern Manitoba, to a right, like it was taken for granted. It was taken for granted. So how did it happen? Well, it actually started 50 years ago. And one of the pivotal events that really affects things today that is largely unrecognized is the 1972 United Nations Environment Conference in Stockholm, at which the ever-industrial Maurice Strong managed to get non-government organizations legitimized as participants at a conference that prior thereto was only attended by political bodies, governments. And so what happened was back then the Sierra Club was created in the late 1800s to protect national parks from mountain climbing. The Greenpeace, their big crusade was nuclear testing in the Aleutian Islands and Wales. It goes on. The Pembina Institute was created in 1982, basically because they were tried to be asphyxiated by sour gas in the Lodgepole blowout. And if you go look at the whole ENGOs, if you look at what's World Economic Forum, it's an ENGO. It's another government organization. What is the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change? So what's happened, started in 1972, that these non-government organizations that have tremendous influence, they're machines, they're an industry on themselves, have become major players. And they're almost all singularly focused on climate or some derivative thereof. And so again, the question I had to ask myself, I grew up during the Cuban Missile Crisis when I was a kid. I'm 68. When I was a kid in grade school, we used to see the black and white movies, how Calgary was always a target for the nukes, right? Because we're an oil center. So that if we saw the movie, that if we hid under the desk, that we could stave off thermonuclear incineration by a couple of seconds. You know, I'd go home and say, are we going to put a bomb shelter in the basement, Mom and Dad? We had an air raid siren in the new neighborhood in Southwood. They turned that on, blew every window out in the 2-block radius. And then this was a problem. And my parents, of course, the grand ancestors of, or they're the descendants of sodbusters, had grown up in the Depression and the Second World War. So these were the problems I was raised on. I was raised on real poverty. I was raised on global conflict. I was raised on thermonuclear annihilation, the Vietnam War, and then all of a sudden there was climate change. Holy cow! So it started in '72. Environment became a concern. I think one of the first major event was probably the book Silent Spring in 1962, when DDT was as a chemical was labeled. Now DDT was actually the guy that invented DDT actually got the Nobel Prize after he saved so many lives from malaria in the Second World War. The population bomb in 1968, Robert Ehrlich's contribution to the world. There were too many people. He's the one that wanted to put sterility chemicals in the drinking water in the United States without telling anybody to control the population. Club of Rome, 1972, the OPEC oil prices. And we were going to run out of everything. But the next most pivotal event to me was 1988. Now, at that time, I was the editor of an oil magazine and liked to read a lot. And that was when the United States Senate had hearings in New York City on global warming. And James Hansen from NASA showed up and made the first front page news predictions on global warming and the ensuing catastrophe. Now, at that time, I was a young oil writer, and I went over to the Canadian Petroleum Association to see Ian Smythe at that time, the chairman. Of course, I said, "What's this? What do you make of this global warming thing? They think that oil is toxic." And of course, that time oil prices had collapsed. The economy was in the dumpsters. What we're hearing today was, at that time, people knew, and we should have cut the supply of gasoline and diesel fuel or started rationing it then. But of course, what would happen if you'd done that? Well, the average person said, well, we can't sell you jet fuel, gasoline, or diesel fuel anymore because we think it could be a problem. So we say this with the gift of 2020 hindsight, woulda, coulda, shoulda, but people have to think back to what would really happen. The next pivotal event, and this was a real needle mover in my view, because my wife was the principal at a school, and that was Al Gore's movie, An Inconvenient Truth. Now, when I wrote the book, I refreshed my memory that he received both a Nobel Prize and an Oscar for that book. As you know, you may or may not know, the snows at Kilimanjaro are still there, although he predicted otherwise. But what really happened was my wife was a school principal at junior high. And what she found was her teacher sticking an inconvenient truth into the DVD player in the classroom and calling it a lesson plan. And so if you were in grade 1 in 2006, you're of voting age today. So what started out, and he was a hero for this. And then this segued on to the Paris Climate Agreement, the various UN conferences. The first was the Rio Earth Summit in 1992, where everybody got together. There was the creation of the IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change. There was Kyoto Summit in 1997, where they invented the world carbon trading system. And so it took a long time for these various forces, these continuous conferences, to come along and end up impacting human thought and human behavior. The other major twist in this, before we'll get into a little bit more of this, is the internet. I was a writer starting in 1979 when we bought an oil magazine. And I was in the pre-internet writing era where I wrote op-ed for the various newspapers and televisions. I was on the CBC political panel. And what happened then was pre-internet was, if you were interviewed, say, for Maclean's magazine, and some of you probably have this, they had something called a fact checker. And the fact checker was able, when you were quoted in an article, you'd get a call from somebody. I see Eric Newell here. Mr. Newell, because you would have been interviewed a million times. Mr. Newell, this is Joe Blow with Maclean's. You were quoted as saying that oil is okay. Is this what you said? And, on and on, you check it. And the facts were a badge of honor, but the impact the internet had was twofold. Was one, it eviscerated the ad revenue of the local papers. And the old school media, that looking at the age of the people on the screen that we all grew up on, where they were fact based, and the truth was a badge of honor, has been eroded. What's really happened to the media, it's not that journalists don't care. It's not that they try to print baloney. It is just that as the advertising revenue has disappeared, so has their editorial staff, so has their research staff. And the internet also caused a whole bunch of alternate media sources. It used to be that if you wrote an article that did not contain the truth, you were, first of all, there were ways to punish you in a newspaper. You would lose advertisers, or people would cancel their subscriptions, or you could be sued if you wrote the wrong thing. So as more and more media sources grew up, came along, there were more and more people got a platform to say the most outrageous thing. I mean, the term fake news was not coined until Donald Trump popularized it in 2016. It actually happened years before that with the internet. One of the most salient presentations I heard was there was a pollster. It was 2013, and I was the outgoing chairman of the Petroleum Services Association of Canada. We had a pollster in that did a lot of work for CAP. And he was talking about how do we reach the millennials, and the oil industry was just waking up to the fact that we had a problem here. It was 2012 where the public hearings for the Northern Gateway pipeline, where thanks to the internet, I wanted to say this first, thanks to the internet, the non-government organizations in the United States using the internet managed to get 4,000 interveners from all over the world with a form letter raining down on the hearings for the Northern Gateway pipeline. And all hell broke loose. And then Harper tried to control the process, and then he was fighting democracy. But I just wanted to point out that torpedoing the hearings for the Line 9 reversal, which was prior to the year, this was the pipeline that Trudeau ordered built from Sarnia to Montreal, when they tried to switch from east to west as soon as the price went down. When Suncor tried to change it back from west to east, there was a great huge cry. Now it's 2012. So the oil guys are going, what, beam me up, Scotty. What happened? How did I get into this mess? So this pollster held up his smartphone, and he said, everybody in the oil industry and all this, how do I reach those millennials? Those kids nowadays, they don't read everything. The fact is they read everything. That's the problem. We've all got kids and grandkids. Give me the goddamn thing. You should have a meter on this so they're not reading it all the time. What has happened with all the things I just said, the combination of the foregoing, all the non-government organizations have turned climate change into an industry. They have the algorithms in the phone feed. They're all streamed, right? They find out what you like and feed you more. So what he said, you've got a generation of kids that not only have they seen Al Gore's movie, but they grow up only reading what they want to read. When we all grew up, when the paper showed up on the Monday, we got the Albertan at my house, and a little kid, and you got a little bit of everything in the old stream newspaper because they didn't know what people wanted, right? So you'd get a little bit of sports, you get a little bit of news, you get some world affairs, you got some politics, and whether you wanted it or not, if you had any interest in what was going on in the world, you got force-fed a little bit. And now, particularly in the last 15 years, you just see what you want. You can live your entire life on Kim Kardashian baseball scores and whatever the hell the software on your machine tells you. And so this has changed the narrative incredibly in the information we get and how we get the narrative. So all of these factors, and then the last factor, of course, is good old-fashioned fear. Fear sells. Fear is a moneymaker. It is really amazing what happens to people's thinking when the subject at hand is your own mortality. And this started out with Malthus in the 1700s. He feared that the world was going to run out of food. And then it goes back to the ones I mentioned, Silent Spring, the population bomb. And climate change was the biggest fear getter of all. It was beyond a doubt the granddaddy of all apocalypses. And so we had the opportunity to not only broadcast this. The last twist, and I think this is really important, is is again, going back to going to energy, where it used to be a privilege and has become a right. I read this great book called The Progress Paradox in 2003 by Greg Easterbrook. And it was how life gets better when people feel worse. And what he wanted to know was the world was a better place by any metric, and it still is. The child birth rates were declining. The number of people going on was up. The income was up. The number of people education were going down. As countries modernized, the birth rates declined, population stabilized. People were living longer by every measure. Life on Earth was better, and people just refused to believe that we were anything other than on the precipice of disaster. And so the conclusion he came to, and of course I got the little dog ears from the quotes because I went back and read the book, was what happened is that material needs had been replaced by spiritual needs. That we got so wealthy in Western society, we're able to switch from what do I need to how do I feel? And happiness became a commodity. And this is what happened to energy. Is this what happened to climate? Climate became an issue. And I'm not going to say for a moment that spewing goop into the atmosphere is not a problem. I'm not going to suggest that runaway emissions are not affecting the weather. I'm not questioning the science of the IPCC. But what I am questioning is that what we have done is we've taken energy for granted at our peril. And we have made some egregious mistakes.
I think you've done an extraordinary job bringing us to today, whether or not we all feel we're in some spiritual world or whether or not the issues of today are more social than they are economic, at least up until last week. I did find your comments about privilege versus right, depending upon where I am in the world, and also depending your point of whether or not we've moved from an economic phase into an appreciation we're now spiritual or social. I'm not sure that prevails across the earth. The third world may be looking at energy in a very different way than we do in Canada, for example.
Well, that actually is the segue into the next section on politics, actually, because in the sense that the phenomena of fear, of having the time to be scared, of have the time to worry about, and this is really going back, this is the 50-year history of having the opportunity to worry about what the level of the ocean may or may not be in 2100, as opposed to how I'm going to get food on the table tomorrow morning. That is purely an OECD Western world phenomena.
Okay, so I'm going to ask Bob Mitchell. I know Bob's got a question.
David, I'm wondering, it seems to me that with COVID, one of the results of COVID is we're shortening supply lines. And one of the results of the Ukraine, I think, is the realization that you should never, for strategic purposes, you should never outsource the things that your economy runs on. If you can avoid it, don't do it.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering how we get Canada to realize that barring these pipelines going across the country to make us self-sufficient, we've made a mistake that's about similar to deciding we're going to have an artificial heart and pump oil into our system on an ongoing basis and think that's a good idea when it's coming from an unstable place like Russia.
Oh, your heart went. I was just thinking your heart pump might be in the garage, and hope the line doesn't freeze. There's the problem is Canada as a country is a work in progress. And part of the work in the stuff I'm not really going into today, Alberta, a carbon story, part of the history of Alberta, the first time that Western oil producers went to Ottawa and tried to sell oil to Montreal was 1957. And that was what had happened in 1954. And I was 1 year old. Was the United States had become quite protectionist on its oil industry because there's a flood of new supplies from places like Venezuela. So the Western producers, I believe Dome Petroleum was at the head of this, and Home Oil, they were not integrated in the sense the big guys like Imperial had refineries in Montreal and production in Venezuela. They went to the federal government in 1957 and tried to, the Borden Commission was in session, and tried to convince Ottawa to buy the federal government to turn this into a country, to build another ribbon of communication like the ones like the railroad did. And they were rebuffed. It was going to cost more. And there's some question as to whether the refiners cared. So we ended up with a North-South Oil Trade. The only time that the country has behaved as you asked, Bob, was in the 1970s. That's when all of a sudden security of supply became an issue with OPEC and the National Energy Program. And then at that time, that's when they worried about where the oil was coming from, who owned it. And there were steps made in that direction. That is when Justin Pierre Trudeau ordered the pipeline from Sarnia to Montreal. We probably wouldn't have one then. That's when that pipeline was built. So what we have is the answer to your question, tragically, is what do we have to do? Is unfortunately we've got to restructure the country. I mean, the thing is built wrong in the sense, if you look at the Constitution and the Senate. They drive the bus, and common sense only works at times like this. I wish I had a better answer, but when you're in an area when energy goes from a privilege to a right, people don't care as long as they hit the switch on the wall and the darn lights go on. What problem? What problem? You know, and they don't care. And it's really a tragedy that the prices have to do what they do. And we have to have events like we have where people start saying, well, wait a second, instead of saying, why doesn't my energy come from solar panels? They maybe pause and say, I'm just happy that I hit the switch and there's energy there at all.
Okay, so I'm going to get into another question. That was excellent. Anthony Benson?
So my question is, how do we tap into the digitization to increase our global supply of oil and gas?
The first thing I want to say is I would say the industry was in denial for the longest time. Engineers are not really good at understanding what people are thinking. If you're at the boardroom of an oil company and sales are going up, and this is the most bizarre industry possibly in the world, where the customers hate you and they punish you by buying more of your product. And so you're sitting there at the board level and the cash is rolling in. And they're fueling up with refined oil sands to get to the pipeline protest. And you go, what me worry? But there have been attempts, I think in the last couple of years, there are some sub works that are using just the tools you mentioned, Anthony, that have gone in and they're doing it. Actually, there's an outfit called Modern Miracle Network with the ever energetic Michael Binion. There's another outfit called Resource Works out of the West Coast with Stuart Muir. And what these people are doing is they're decentralizing their media to hundreds of little pro-industry voices that are building their own little networks. So fortunately, we were late to the party, Anthony, but you're absolutely right. And I can say that there's been more progress made, I'd say in the last 3 or 4 years, in using the same tools that have been used against the industry to go out and build a positive result. And it's some remarkable things that are happening, and they don't make the news because the news doesn't follow them, right? But they do reach influencers. But Michael Binion made a really good point in a presentation we're at, is what really affects people's decisions is their peer group. That is an amazingly powerful force. And I know this because I lost my son to Vancouver Island. He was a perfectly normal conservative human being who worked for us at my oil service company in the summers. And he got sucked into the Victoria anti-oil sands vortex. And he knows all his buddies are full of beans, but his network, his group hates oil sands. And so we had a bunch of, this being taped, I can't tell you why I know this. We had some money laying around and we wanted to make a movie about Fort McMurray. And so they've got a little production shop. So we went to my son and said, hey, you guys are pretty good at making videos. I said, I got a client with a bunch of dough that wants to say something nice about just the town, not the community. And gee, Dad, we can't touch that. Okay. So we're winning, Anthony. We're on it. It's better than it's ever been, but it's a correction in a great big mother of a super tanker, let me tell you.
David, I was fascinated by your story of the 4,000 form letters and how they totally disrupted the hearing. What puzzles me is why those who ran the hearing reacted to that and didn't simply dismiss it as something that comes from Looney Tunes land and moved on.
They did actually. The Harper government, Joe Oliver was the Minister of Energy, and they actually changed the rules, and they actually changed the NEB hearing rules on the fly. But the National Energy Board was really never set up to deal with this. The NEB was a body, an august body that dealt with economic issues and the setback of a pipeline from a school. Was it deep enough under the river? And was the project of a net economic benefit? And so what happened is social issues, and this was very clever by the non-government organizations. Remember, the tar sands campaign is in full swing by this time, and this is another angle that one of Marie Strong's gifts to the world was these activist NGOs is using the internet, and they're starting to bring up social issues about, and of course, there's the First Nations issues and the land claim issues. And so Harper did change the rules on the National Energy Board. And you may recall that in 2015, or may not recall, because you got to be a nerd like me to follow these things, one of Trudeau's campaign commitments was to modernize the National Energy Board so that his tribe could carry the day. And that's where Bill C-69 came from. And that's why I try to put these lines in the sand in my presentation and try to say just exactly what I think the pivotal events were that took Canada from hero to zero in terms of our ability to supply energy to the world and our current predicament.
This takes us really to section number 2, which talks about politics and the internet and human behavior. So you're on, David, for phase 2 of this.
Yeah, thank you very much. Well, oil's been political or geopolitical from the get-go. The history of politics and oil really starts out when the British Navy discovered it was way better for warships than coal. It has more powerful, and that resulted in the big discoveries in the Middle East. And so that's why the Middle East looks like Western Canada. That was the British in action with their survey transits. If you look at the borders between Iraq and all those countries over there, it's just like Saskatchewan, Manitoba. You know, this is the British in action. They made no adjustments for the geography. At least we did that with the Great Divide in Alberta, BC. Or the cultures or all the other factors that affect that. And so that's when oil became a weapon. A political weapon. Of course, it was very political, as was said in the introduction, or maybe it was in the chat that Perry and I had before, that when the First World War, thanks to oil, that's when they had political, and these are all political wars. All wars are political in a way because they had the airplane, which was a coal-fired airplane was not practical. The solar-powered airplane, nobody conceived that yet. And then away it went with, and the reason that we won the war, and this goes back to Jurgen's epic book, The Prize, which is on the shelf. And he talked about how the West won, and it was really the oil fields of West Texas that made the U.S. the powerful force it was in the First and Second World War. That's what happened at Turner Valley. Those of you oil nerds will remember that the cap, the naphtha cap, the oil, the liquids on top of the oil, they blew that baby down for the war effort to make aviation fuel. But that's why one of the reasons Germany lost is first thing they tried to get was the oil fields in Romania, which was political. And then the same problem with the Japanese. I mean, they were digging up trees and making gasoline out of tree roots. The Germans were invented, I believe it was the Fischer-Tropsch process where they managed to make hydrocarbon fuel out of coal. So this is the politics of oil. It's always been political. It was political in 1973 was the pivotal event when the OPEC all discovered that they had oil, the giant US fields. Western Canadian conventional production before the oil sands got traction peaked in about 1972, 1973. And that was about the same time that the legacy US oil fields were over the hill, conventional fields. And so OPEC in 1973 looked around and used the Western participation in the first Arab-Israeli war as a reason to cut off fuel. And then oil became incredibly political during that period, and as a weapon, as a weapon. And so they jacked up the price. And of course, we talked a bit about that in the answer to one of my questions. Then Alberta became extraordinarily wealthy. And then when you get into oil and politics, of course, the derivatives are amazing. You'll find out that the really popular premiers in Alberta history, like Lougheed was OPEC and Klein got gas. And then you'll find a whole bunch of other premiers that are unpopular. It's got nothing to do with their ability. It's really got to do with the price of hydrocarbons and how much money they had to toss around. So anyway, in the 70s, oil became a security supply became an issue. We got the National Energy Program. And this is when the polling was invented. And this is when the Liberal Party, I know Peter Foster wrote a wonderful book called The Sorcerer's Apprentice, and he called it government by, I want to say Ipsos, government, anyway, the polling company at the time. And what they discovered was that, if you remember, that Joe Clark had won a brief government, and he wanted to raise the price of oil or gasoline by 17 cents for security of supply and to balance the books. And what they discovered was, if we tax the hell out of Alberta and cap the price and move and defang the West, we can win an election. And so it began. This was the beginning of oil and energy-based political tribalism. One of the great books, I spent 10 years inside the tent in party politics, and nothing I'm particularly proud of. But in 2008, when 2006, when Ed Stelmach won the PC leadership under the pledge to get Alberta a fair deal in 2007, when he brought out Our Fair Share, that Alberta was rolling in money, and decided that the right thing to do was raise royalties. They had more money. They couldn't even give it all away, if you remember at the time. They had the most incredible explosion of money, and politically they said, let's go get more. And they won a big election. So I joined the Wildrose Party at that time and spent 10 years in party politics. I helped get Danielle Smith elected leader. Sorry about that. I was the party president when they all walked out. That was a low moment. I'm still suffering from post-floor crossing stress disorder. But what I learned in that 10 years from when I got involved to when I went home, I liked Brian Jean. What I liked about Brian, he was my kind of guy. He worked in the middle of the night, in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of winter. And when he lost, I went home. But in that 10-year period was the development of polling, of target policy through social media. And this was the period where we were hunting for Facebook, where you could go and you could go find a group of voters, of single issue voters, and figure out how they were. So this is when the internet, social media, and big data was captured by politics. And so what I learned in my 10 years in the tent was, I kept thinking about, big, grandiose public policy. What I learned in my 10 years in party politics was that, no, we don't give a shit about anything. Who votes? So they only care about 60% of the population, because 40% doesn't vote. So 40% of the people. This is why when you see a public opinion poll on pipelines, you'll find 55% of Canadians in favor. And then you'll find that 35% of the population can win the election and block your pipelines. So what happened during that period? And then I found this remarkable book, or this remarkable story about a guy named James Buchanan, who won a Nobel Prize in economics for the public choice theory. And it was fascinating reading, because the public choice theory was this: one of the foundations of economics is self-interest. So what Buchanan did, was it for that 36 years ago? He said, well, how come is it when you're elected to public office, why is it you suddenly become altruistic? Why don't you just do things to your own benefit? And everybody kind of knows that, that, you write a big check, you get a meeting with the minister, and on and on and on. But he institutionalized it. It was so revolutionary that he won. And the public choice theory simply was that politicians are not altruistic. Politicians go where the votes are. And so you've got the combination of, you've got the new tools to find your voters. You got the internet scaring the crap out of everybody on climate change. And then and so what happened is the ideal, and this is the second whole section of my book on carbon politics, is what a beautiful issue climate change was. Because you could be altruistic and go find a very, very focused tribe of voters and deliver the bacon, all in one fell swoop. And so this is one of the reasons why we end up with John Horgan. And John Horgan is a real pro-industry guy. Anybody who knows his background, he was a union leader. He was all for building LNG plants. He was all for energy, or sort of Northern Gateway. He was a non-government union guy, loved the jobs. But what he discovered was there were more votes to be had by campaigning against Trans Mountain. And what else matters except winning the election? And so this is what Trudeau did in 2015. Is that he went and said, well, what are the hot buttons? He said, Alberta will never vote for me anyway, thanks to my dad. And so where are the votes? Well, they're urban now. And I did a little study in this chapter and started looking at the urbanization of Canada. It's really quite scary that 65% of the population of Canada lives in urban centers of 100,000 or more outside of the resource producing sections of Western Canada. So you got all of Manitoba, all of Saskatchewan, all of Alberta, and the non-lower mainland part of BC. And 65% of the voters outside of those areas where we still dig things up and sell them and grow things, and of course includes the entire Western Canadian Sedimentary Basin, live in large urban centers. And large urban centers, what do they know about energy? Well, the switch is on the wall. There's a gas station on the corner. There's an airport nearby. And I'll unplug my cell phone charger at night as my contribution to reducing my energy footprint. And they were told that you don't have to worry. You vote for me and I'll fix it. I'll fix it. I'll take those guys down east. I'll block pipelines. I'll tax carbon. And so what it became was due to an incredible set of circumstances, it became a political issue that if you vote for me and I'll change the weather. And I don't think anybody thought this through. And this has got nothing to do with the science of climate change. I want to stop here again. I am not for 1 second. In fact, just to show you how strongly I feel about this, I got one slide I'm going to show you here, just because I think this is incredibly important. This is renewables versus fossil fuels. Did I do that right, Perry?
You're up.
Yeah. Here's a sort of 100 years of history. And this is fantastic. I want to say this because I believe it. I think electric cars are a fantastic thing if I could just get to Edmonton and back in the winter. I think that wind is fantastic. Hydroelectricity, Alberta is based on it, certainly southern Alberta. We love the stuff, and nuclear power is wonderful. But here's the reality of where we're fighting this election. We've got the incumbent fossil fuels, and traditional biomass is wood and grass, and we're looking at, and this, so all of this promises, all these elections, all of these pipeline blockages, and we have not made a dent, because what's happened during this time is, the good news is as the population is growing and energy demand is growing as we've modernized, the good news is that a lot of this is being filled with renewables, and it will continue to be done to do so. But the reality is from a political point of view, I just say that energy and politics have become intertwined. It's because of the climate issue. I think climate, frankly, has been exploited by the political process and has obfuscated the needs of energy. The primary function of energy should be supplying energy. It should not be a political battlefield, and it has become a political battlefield. And that is, so the politics is, they're looking for the next issue. The good news is that this will change. Politicians are very predictable, like Klein said, or many said, find a parade and get in front of it. So when security, supply, and the cost of energy becomes an issue, they'll do it. But until such that happens, this was all oil's energy has always been political. It's always been geopolitical. We're reminded yet again, and this has led to, certainly in my view, in Canada and places like Europe, they've made some very poor decisions. They have bringing on renewables is a great idea, but the pace at which renewables were brought on has exceeded. They were brought on at a certain pace, but they have not backfilled. They don't have storage. They don't have backup supply. So they've been mothballing coal and gas, as we're learning the hard way, at too high a rate. And so that is the climate energy politics. And it is, frankly, I don't think it's served us well.
It's the pace of the transition that is really becoming the issue, not that it is necessary. I think there has been a general acknowledgement that we've got to deal with climate change.
I'm there. Yeah, you bet.
The biggest issue is those that have the levers over the pace of change from your graph seem to not be making an impact. And those that want to see change seem to be proclaiming that the sky is falling. It's an existential crisis. Everything needs to be done immediately.
Here's the other graph that sort of reinforces what I said. I put 19, this is out of my slide deck of the same title as this presentation, and of roughly the same title. But here's 1988. This is the high water mark. This is when James Hansen wakes up the world. And look at the behavior in the West, where we could. And so the United States, look at their emissions, and that's been done by replacing coal with fracking. And the EU has done its part, and Europe's done a great job. North America has generally declined in terms of total emissions and this is a combination of factors. But look what we've done, and what we've done, India and China and the rest of the world. And so what we've done as we make these decisions, in Western Canada, and in Canada and North America and Europe, as we decarbonize, as we go to these COP conferences and make all these pledges, the problem is all we've done in the West, and this wasn't my idea, this was a very clever writer out of Britain, Tim Watkins, who writes The Consciousness of Sheep. He said, we've just outsourced our emissions. What we have done in our, for whatever, the combination of everything I've said, we have not reduced emissions on a global basis. We have outsourced the emissions. And so the conclusion that I came to in my book is the best thing we could do is to help China decarbonize coal. And that's just not a vote getter. But anyway, we'll get to that in the next section. But I just wanted to, this was the last piece of data that I classify as foundational in my assessment of where we're at.
Well, we'll come back to China in a moment. Greg, you've got a question?
I'll just fill in some color around. Thanks, David. It's always tough to characterize history. This revisionist history, people that haven't been there, weren't around, make up stories. And again, the algorithms on social media feed the often incorrect worldviews, misinformation, disinformation. I'll just add a couple of points. Good public policy is whatever gets people in power, either elected or reelected. I would put everyone on to Jody Wilson-Raybould's book if you want a 2020, 2021 take on that. On the National Energy Board process, I was there as that was happening, representing little outfits like Suncor and the government of Alberta. Those proceedings were set up to regulate the build of facilities and the rates under which those facility costs would be recovered by regulated utilities. No. They weren't set up to deal with social acceptance or anything like that, completely ill-equipped. Yeah. So as that wave came, everyone at those hearings was just going, what's going on here? People stated they had an interest, and the NEB was completely ill-equipped. And I would argue still today are ill-equipped to deal with those sorts of movements. The piece on the energy transition that I'd like everyone to think about just a little bit more is the value of distributed renewables to reduce our reliance on expensive and large-scale facilities, large-scale generation, transmission, distribution. If we have renewables at the point of consumption, we can actually reduce our reliance. A lot of those facilities we're either building for new demand or replacing due to retirement. So there's an angle there that has got nothing to do with all green tomorrow. My questions, wondering if, and maybe get Bob Mitchell to chime in as well. Are you familiar with Bill Reese out in Vancouver? He's a scientist and he's done some of the most articulate science on the climate change. He kind of winds up in the same place we have today, is we have no idea how to move the whole issue forward collaboratively. But Bill Reese's work is fantastic if anyone wants to look and delve deeper into the science. And a Calgarian by the name of Dr. John Harper, if anyone here has heard of John's work. And John was a geologist, geophysicist, and engineer, university department head, and international energy consultant around the world, worked in over 80 countries. And he wasn't a denier, but he has a chart, which I still have, unfortunately passed away 2 years ago. And I call it the ping pong ball slide. And it talks going from ice age to evaporative 5 times. And the ping pong ball, ice age, evaporative, ice age, evaporative, ice age, and we're halfway up. It's a 300 million year slide. We're halfway up. You could ask a 3-year-old where the ball's probably going. And so John's not a denier. He just doesn't think there's anything we can do on CO2 mitigation to stop that ball. And we should be spending our time on reducing plastics, pollution, poverty, and I would add to that list, using our renewable or non-renewable resources like bitumen to make carbon fiber and glass, and not use it to heat our homes and drive around. So a lot there, but over to you, David.
I don't think there was a question in there, but it was all very interesting. But I will say, I think that's great stuff, and I appreciate that. I just want to say one thing about the NEB. And you said, and I appreciate your background and your perspective, and we're going to get into the economic section on your bit about distributed renewable. Going to your point about the NEB, what I discovered just in the early 80s was we had the lodgepole blowout of 1972 and then 1977, and then Amoco in its wisdom, within sight of the other wellhead, drilled another one in 1982. But anyway, I had the magazine, and so this was a top of the line story. And then we had the critical gas, sour gas commission. Lougheed was mad, and why nobody threw a match on it was beyond me. But anyway, they didn't. And what I discovered at that time, when and this was part of the great phenomena, what I discovered was how much politicians loved regulators. And the economic case for drilling a sour gas well was very good, but going to the people that lived nearby or downwind after they'd all had we sprayed sour gas all the way to Winnipeg. That was a hell of a well, boys. We should, and ladies, we should own that baby. That was apparently, how much was it flowing? Oh, we don't know. Well, the guys that know, the AOF testers, when you got 9 5/8 blowing full bore, they figured it was 300 million cubic feet of gas a day. Anyway, I digress. We did have some great reservoirs in Alberta back in the day. But what happened was they went to the ERCB and they had this task force. And after that, the government, politicians love regulators because they say, well, I'd like to drill a sour gas well in your community. And to save any politician from having to stand up and say poison gas is good for you, we'll have a public hearing. And so this is what really the flaw in the National Energy Board was, that you bring the point out very well, is the NEB was constructed for its mechanical, for facilities and laws. But when social issues came in, they said, well, what about the pollution? What about the carbon footprint? And as the momentum gained on the climate issue and all the rights issue, as how I feel became as important to how I eat, then politicians increasingly deferred to regulators. And that's what happened to the regulators, is they were given, they were a cover for lack of political courage among the political class. When the polling indicated there were more votes to be lost by standing up for a pipeline than there was to be gained by not building it.
Well, Eric, you lived through that. You've got a question.
Yeah, I just want to put a few things in perspective for people to just jog your memory a bit, and hopefully I don't talk too long. But first of all, energy security was not always the big issue. Twice Syncrude, we got our permit canceled because the world was concerned too much oil would be brought onto the market.
Yeah.
Just remember that. And second, and it was only Peter Lougheed in 1971 who finally said, Syncrude, you can go ahead, but you will never, ever produce more than 109,000 barrels per day,
Yeah.
which of course, Syncrude is producing 350,000 barrels today. So that's one thing. The other one, David, and I'm not being defensive here, I love your description of us guys in the boardrooms, the oil and gas industry, but some of us actually did work out there, tried to do positive things. I spearheaded the National Oil Sands Task Force, which was made up of 35 organizations and 70 individuals. Took 2 years to come up with an energy vision for Canada. We changed, we did a number of things, changed the fiscal regime across the country and that. And Anne McClellan called it the most successful Ottawa campaign strategy since the free trade debate with Brian Mulroney. So we actually did do some things that are positive. All the different stakeholders were on that task force. I tried to get the environmentalists, or we tried, I shouldn't have personalized it totally. They didn't want to come. They didn't want to be co-opted, but they weren't organized either. Greenpeace hadn't set us out as a target yet. And U of C did a master's thesis on it with Ted Morton was the supervisor. And it was actually a pretty good bit of work. They characterized us as public policies entrepreneurs, with me leading, and that sometimes policy can't get set by governments or industries, that take some individuals to straighten it around. So we did a lot, but the writer of the thesis, remarkable young woman, Jessica Dawn Marie Weber by name, she had posed the question at the end, do you think we would have been successful if the environmentalists had been organized? And I think you've been beating around that a lot, because somewhere along the lines, and maybe it was the internet, I think that's how you characterize, but we came up with this term that started to pervade things called the social license to operate, and nobody ever could define what that meant. But at some point, we turned this whole issue from a factual, energy supply demand type of issue into a religious issue. It's like based on belief. And to me, that's the fundamental question. How do we get it back just to common sense? And our webinar series in December was trying to get exactly at that point. Instead of always, like right now, the strategy around climate change, if you'll have to excuse me for saying this, is shut down fossil fuels as fast as you can. The strategy ought to be reduce emissions. They're not the same thing. I mean, how can you get rid of fossil fuels when the infrastructure is not there for the alternate energy supply to be there? The production side only produces 15% of the emissions. 85% come from home heating, business heating, motor vehicles, all that. Yeah, we don't have the infrastructure in place. Surely can't we get that issue on the table and start timing this thing?
Eric?
So that's the one of the issues. The other one, and I think Ukraine's situation is going to blow it out of the water, is we tack this whole global issue as individual nation states, and so we're not doing the right thing in Canada. That's what our webinar said. We should be developing LNG like crazy and getting it over to Asia and cut down the displaced coal, and we'd make a bigger impact doing that than anything else. Now watch what happens in Ukraine. Canada has said we'll stop Russian oil imports. I don't think the US will do that because they're worried they're going to explode their prices. So, we can't seem to look at this thing as a global issue. So how do we get it from a religious basis to just some common sense working? And how do we get it to, how do we start operating that this is a global issue, needs global solutions? It's not one that's made up of nation state interests.
2 words, price and misery.
Paul set this question up when he said, have we done nothing? Well, clearly people are continuing to consume and demand for energy. They'll even accept $1.55 a gallon. I'm not sure that's going to drive down consumption. So the individuals are continuing to demand energy in order to protect their lifestyles. Industry is adapting. I mean, I think we heard dramatic changes going on within industry. That is, the suppliers, even though the consumer wants cleaner, the industries are going there. We heard of numerous adjustments being made in adoption of emerging technologies. And we even heard a recognition that more regulation may well, in fact, be called for on the emission side. And we also are seeing a lot of protesting going on of some things to be done. We're seeing people protest in Ukraine to keep them away from their nuclear plants. We're hearing individuals protest in the streets of Canada to try and make adjustments as well. So we are seeing people reacting, meaning the issue is becoming more popular. But we clearly haven't reduced the amount of oil that is being consumed in the earth at large. So David, over to you. What can be done?
Well, we tend to think of. I finally concluded that the human mind can't think big, and what I mean big is everybody. And there's 7.9 billion people on the earth, and that is an incomprehensible number of people. It is. Everybody says it. I'm told with great certainty that there's too many. But there's lots of people that don't have any yet. So I don't know what others know what the ideal population of the world is. In the end of my book, I confess that I'm not, it's not in my DNA to tell everybody else what to do. The answer to the question is that the question is, it's a really good segue into the realities of energy. And energy is, when he says we know it caused by, what have we done? Nothing. And who the heck is we? Well, my we is 7.9 billion earthlings in various states of development and poverty. And we on the climate file tends to be the OECD countries, the 1.3 billion people that live in Europe, and the OECD countries are Europe, North America. I think Colombia made it in the States. There's nobody from Africa. And in Asia, there's Japan, South Korea, New Zealand, and the United States. So that's generally the we. And the English is the common language, and most of the commerce is done among this we. And the fact is, there's 6.6 billion people. They will call them for who progressives speak for, but don't speak to. And I don't know if any of you have been fortunate enough to travel. That's a great, the dirty side of the oil business is, my joke for years has been, God didn't put oil anywhere nice. And so I've been to all these places and places like Africa and the jungles of Indonesia and the backwaters of Brazil and in the high Arctic and so on. And the reality is that the climate risk, and just a correction on this, the environment was an issue in Stockholm. The climate wasn't yet. It really wasn't. The climate didn't become a UN issue till the Rio Earth Conference in 1992. Actually, it was that the Stockholm was about the environment at that time. Indira Gandhi was furious, as everybody. We're talking about pollution, generally environmental pollution, and so the disparities between the developed and the non-developed world starts to see. But I think the easiest way to explain this is the two forecasts. One is the IEA, International Energy Agency forecast, and they have the net zero by 2050 forecast, and they show what exactly has to be done. Oil consumption has to fall by 75% or 70% by the year 2050. And we have to, and it's all based on, even in their own disclosure, they admit that we'll have to be depending on technologies that don't exist yet, which is a level of candor and fine print that nobody seems to be covered. At the same time, OPEC does an annual forecast, and they are talking to the 6.6 billion people that we tend to disclude from our, when we talk about we. And this goes back to your very good point, Eric. We shouldn't be talking about countries. We should be talking about emissions. And that's why I always put that slide in there, the real source of the emissions. I've done a lot of time with CBC over the years, and they all say, well, we must do this, and we must do that. And I said, well, what we really should do is we should be using our brain power to help China and India and in the emerging world use fossil fuels more effectively. We should be cleaning up emissions from coal. We should be displacing their coal with LNG. That's what we should do, because all of the things we do here don't amount to a hill of beans. But if you look at the OPEC forecast, on oil consumption, you'll see something entirely different, because they are looking at the energy needs of not the wealthy, the West, but the poor people. And what the ordinary people of the world do every day. There are so many people in this world are hand to mouth. There's still something like 1 billion people that don't have electricity at all, let alone where it comes from. Malnutrition, thanks to energy, thanks to cheap energy, the global, we don't talk about food. How the hell you can have the conversation about climate and food and not include fossil fuels is beyond me. The largest single source of fertilizer is nitrogen-based fertilizer that right now originally started out with coal made from natural gas. That keeps 40% of the population of the world alive. The intricate linkage between food and fossil fuels, and it's without replacements. The great advancements in agriculture have been made in the yield per hectare, and it's been, or acre, because it's been going straight up for years, and it's all been due to fossil fuels. It's got to do refrigeration. It's got to do with storage. It's got to do with tillage equipment, diesel-powered, powerful tillage equipment. It's got to do with transportation. I read this study, and I've written about it before, how in the wintertime in Canada, a lot of the food in the grocery stores travels 8,000 kilometers. It's been the absolutely one of the most wonderful benefits in modernizing the world. It's increased the population of the world. It's a political issue. That's not an energy issue. So cheap energy is fundamental to life on Earth. And so what happened is that when you say that we ought not to use fossil fuels, fine. But what we have not done is, and this is energy science, not climate science, we have not looked at the science of the alternatives and realized that they're incapable of replacing the incumbent. There's a whole generation of people that can't believe you can't make plastic out of solar electricity. And so the answer to the question, when we know it's caused, what are we doing? Well, we have done amazing things. As issues come along, modern civilization has done some great things. Remember, LA was a sewer, right? So they invented the catalytic converter. I remember Inco, the first time I drove through there, when everything downwind of the stacks at Inco, they did Apollo shot training in the slag piles of Inco, because they thought it was the closest thing to the moon. And then they said, we got to clean up those stacks. They had to deal with acid rain, and they did. And Inco howled all the way to the bank. They said, we can't do this. We'll have to shut down. They're still producing a zillion years later. So as these challenges come along, we have addressed them. The thing is the hubris of modern man is this is why I read you the first line from the book. The global energy complex is 7 billion a year. And people are saying, well, why don't you do this instead of this? And they're completely ignoring energy science. And this goes back to my whole diatribe about the media and the internet. There was a good, thoughtful question about ask us earlier. Misinformation has been around a long time. But when somebody said, this is why I wrote a book about this, when somebody says that we should or could, in Alberta, all we have to do is change to renewables. What's the big deal? Well, what they don't understand is Alberta without oil is Manitoba with mountains. We don't know anywhere near the energy that we produce is used here, and we're able to make a living at it because we sell the people that they need. Oil is powerful and is transportable. Natural gas and coal are the same thing. Electricity is not. I loved your comment about. I wrote it down here, distributed renewables. That's a great idea on a local basis. But the whole point is if we were to abandon the fossil fuel business in Alberta and go to renewable energy, I'd say we'd have to about 2 million people would have to leave, because that's what we do. We create energy that's transportable and sell to people who don't need it. They do not need, everywhere in the world has electricity. We're not going to build a big solar farm in Brooks and sell electricity to Denver. So it's fundamentally it is economic. When the reality is people want energy, and this is what China is faced with. What is China looking at? China wants to modernize. People want to leave the agrarian life and move to the city. What's the first thing they need is electricity. And what can they generate large quantities of electricity with and make the transformational change to the economy of China? It's the only thing they can burn that can put power on the switch at an affordable rate and feed that and allow that many people to, and this is a different sort of transition. Their energy transition is from no energy to some energy. That is their energy transition. What is available in the current suite of energy options? And the only thing that's working today on the scale we need, that the world needs, is fossil fuels. And so we go to these conferences, they go to the UN conferences, and everybody agrees to everything. They go to Paris and they sign everything. And they say, yeah, we're going to do that. We're going to do that. And then what you find is the emissions go up and the commitments go up and the fear goes up. And then they go home and they face their country and the people of their country. And they say, why are they here? Why am I here? What do they need? They need to eat. They need to live. They want a bit of the good life. They want education for their kids. They want decent health care. They want nutrition. They want food. And so the problem is with the massive energy complex and all the studies, I'm sure you've talked about this in your previous seminars, is you can track fossil fuels, the Industrial Revolution, coal, oil, population, and wealth growth, and they are completely in a straight line. And so this is where I started, was at the very beginning. When the first line of my book, they said, what we're going to do with political will, with saying and doing the right things, and with we're going to retool the whole global energy complex, and it's going to be good for you. It's going to be great. And the other factor that we have to factor in, and the party's over on this. One of the other things I've spent a lot of time trying to understand is macroeconomics. I have no formal post-secondary education. I just like to read a lot. When I'm talking about macroeconomics, I'm talking about global economics and capital flows. I've been reading a lot about it for many, many years, and I finally concluded that they don't have any idea what they're doing. They just can't tell anybody, and they can't collect a big salary. But what I do know this is following the trends, in the G7 countries, the debt to GDP ratio was about 55%. Then along came 08 and 09 and quantitative easing. Remember, they got out the bazooka. They flooded the markets with liquidity because Lehman Brothers and these insurance companies collapsed. Well, all I can say is central bank liked what they saw, because after the economy got back on its feet in 10 and 11, they just kept printing money. They kept interest rates really low. They called it quantitative easing. And what they did, what the central banks of the Western world did, in my view, this isn't in my book because I didn't know this then, is what they did. They liked what they saw, and they artificially disguised the performance of the economy. And we apologize. So in 2019, by the time the shit hit the fan with COVID, I know a lot of you have never heard that word, COVID, that is. When the shit hit the fan, it was already up to 95%. And then along came COVID. And so what also happened during that period of time, what really helped the world during this 10 years of 09 to 19, and I really want you to think about this, because that was when renewables went crazy. That is when life was good. Energy was unbelievably cheap. This is when oil prices collapsed, and the United States and Canada did a service to the world. Between 08 and 2020, Canada and the United States put 10 million barrels a day in new production on stream. 2 million of it came from the oil sands in Canada. 8 million came from shale oil. And we kept oil from finding its natural price. So there was no shortage of oil. So you could muck with the energy complex. You could shut down coal-fired generating plants. You could virtue signal, shut down pipelines. The government was printing money. Interest rates were low, and the urban centers were doing great. Then along came COVID. And the last thing to say on the economic section as we close up the last step, the party is over. The government has lost its flexibility. Inflation in the supply chain is rampant. Interest rates, our Bank of Canada rate went up by 25 basis points yesterday, one of many. The cost of everything is going up, and the ability of governments and central banks to disguise the true performance of the economy. This is when the part of the macroeconomic events, when renewables we got reckless with our energy supplies, And you asked a question, Eric, at the end of your comments, what do we do about it? I think I said price and misery. And we got them both in a big way. And
That point was being made in the decarbonization series. I don't know whether it was Dennis McConaughey, that there is no way out of this if you don't start ratcheting up your price of carbon. It's the only way to reduce its consumption. But the limits are really unfathomable and untenable politically. Another point that was being made, some would like to depoliticize energy. You want to depoliticize it, let the government own it. If government owns energy, however, government becomes dependent upon energy to the point that it doesn't listen to people at all. So it seems at least we've got a chance in a democratic environment where people are protesting and making their comments that are being felt by the politicians and making some accommodations to balance the behavior of industry, to balance the behavior of consumers, to balance the pricing. We've got a better chance in a democratic environment to balance these forces than you do when you nationalize.
I know McConaughey quite well, and he's just finished his book about this decarbonization subject, and I'm quite looking forward to reading it. His first book on dysfunction, and I learned a lot from his book on the actions of the Anglos in the United States in torpedoing Keystone and all that stuff. So
let's open it up and see if there are some further questions. We've got about 10 more minutes. So who wants to chime in? I'm not sure I see hands up any place. Bill, Bill Howell, you're one of the more insightful guys on all these issues. I can't imagine you don't have a question to pose to David.
Do you believe in general relativity? Believe in quantum mechanics? You don't believe in economics. That was a good one. Actually, there are people that say that microeconomics is great. Macroeconomics has always been in search of itself.
Well, macroeconomics, I don't understand. And so I was taking liberties with that. Other than the invisible hand of Adam Smith will right wrongs. I've done a lot of seminars on this, and they say, well, you know, that the liberals are going to do this and the liberals are going to do that. And oh my God, is this ever awful? And the point is that I'm with McConaughey, is that this dog won't hunt. And so the aspirations of the liberal climate pledge, net zero electricity by 2035, this many electric vehicles, the decarbonization, the emissions reductions in the oil sands, is I sleep well at night because I know that that's impossible. You know, people say, and McConaughey and I, this is where we differentiate. McConaughey says, well, that's what he said he was going to do. I said, well, in 2015, he said he was going to balance the budget by 2019. So when it comes to politics, I'm so jaded from my 10 years inside the tent that I don't cherry pick the political commitments that I believe are achievable or unachievable. And so the whole point is what I've been seeing on the invisible hand is that the supply chain issues and the inflation and the issues we're dealing with today are going to force central banks to make decisions that the politicians wouldn't make otherwise. And so we're going to see, and then the voter aspirations will change. The politicians will go where the voters are. But as for quantum science and quantum physics, I mean, I'm not exactly sure what that means. What I can tell you is I just did an article for fun on, I took the town of Brooks. And this is what we need to do if you really want to do these things. I took the town of Brooks and I said, what I wanted to do was I wanted to investigate battery storage, possibly the most oversold and under-promising solution to emissions on God's green earth. And so I went, so I said, what I want to do is I want to take battery storage and put it in a quantifiable unit. So I phoned up ASO and I said, what is the electricity consumption of Brooks, Alberta? Population 14,400, 21 megawatts every hour on average. Goes up and down, but there are 21 megawatts. Alberta's 11,000 and some, to put it in perspective. So I said, well, now Brooks is right, just very close to the new solar farm going in. This is a 453 megawatt solar farm, just not that far away as the crow flies. Pretty windy down there. Anybody who's been there, there's lots of turbines in Medicine Hat and a little further south. And so Brooks actually has, in what we're told, ought to have the perfect geography, lots of sun, lots of wind for 100% renewable electricity. So then I said, okay, I'm shutting the power off for a week, 1 week, where we're going to pull a baby Europe, where the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine. What are we going to do? So I said, well, we need backup power. And the EU has just admitted that they need backup power. They've just changed their regulations there for more natural gas generation and more nuclear. France has just gone all in further with, I think, 14 new nuclear plants. They're not going to run out of electricity. And so I went to two options. I phoned up an oil field rental company. I got the biggest bull badass diesel cat generator they sell. 3 megawatt, 3,000 kilowatts or 3 megawatts, V16, 1.3 million. So I said, FOB, all ready to go, just fill her up and plug it in. So I hauled, I think I needed, for that, I needed 3 divided by 4. I just finished this article, 20. I needed 8 of them for 24 megawatts. And at 75% efficiency, they burn $1.1 million worth of diesel for 7 days. So what I could do, now some of them are used and refurbished. So basically I could supply electricity for a week for one-time cost, just buy it the one time for, I think 14 million. So the other alternative was the Tesla Megapack battery. And this was just installed by TransAlta down at Pincher Creek to supply backup for them. And I found a colleague who's taking a master's degree in renewable energy, and he'd done a study on Medicine Hat. The Tesla Megapack battery is 1.5 million. And so what I discovered was to run Brooks for a week, I was going to need 42 Tesla Megapack batteries if they were on full drain sequentially, if I was unable to recharge them. So the price for a week was 63 million. If the electricity went out for 2 weeks, then my diesels would only need another $1 million. My batteries would need another 63 million. And what I'm just trying to do is I'm just trying to give people tangible examples. I had coffee the other day with a guy who took a master's degree at Stanford in renewable energy. And he was just really pessimistic about wind and solar. He said, because it's 3 years, 3 years of carbon-free electricity generation to recover the carbon in the manufacture of the steel and the cement. So we've just got some work to do.
What do you suggest to depoliticize energy, since that seems to be your main point today?
We have a frank discussion of where the emissions are coming from. We take the young people of Canada, instead of terrifying them, be honest to them, admit that voting for Catherine McKenna and voting with your heart isn't going to solve the problem, that it is a global problem. The greatest source of emissions is in the third world. Include them in the dialogue and go agree on the problem, as Eric said. What is the problem? The problem is there's a developing world that's using fossil fuels because that's all they have. They're the greatest source of emissions, and we should focus on that. And then and that's what depoliticizing it was. And his point was, well, it's dealt with on a country and political basis. We are making very poor decisions on a regional basis at great expense. We're taking a generation of young people. I think if we were honest with the youth of today and they explained the enormity of the problem and put them to work, not in protesting, in pipeline protests, put them to work, use a little science and ingenuity, define what the problem is globally, and take all this energy, mental energy, and take all our capital and put it to work on the real problem. And we're not doing that. We're not doing that.
Okay, do you have a point of question you want to raise?
Thank you, David, for an excellent presentation and for the comments. I want to ask you just a couple of questions. And why is it that efficiency is such the lowly, ugly sister of energy? Everybody talks about efficiency. It's not sexy. And somehow that is where the low-hanging fruit is.
When I researched carbon taxes, everyone I talked to said that if a properly constructed carbon tax, and this included people like Jack Mintz, that a properly constructed carbon tax would over time help people make the right decisions and drive to efficiency. But the properly constructed carbon tax was meant to be cash neutral, meaning that as carbon taxes went up, some other tax was meant to go down. so that in the end, if you did things like insulate your house, you have the cash to do it because your GST went down or the cost of something else went down. And what we've seen is there's a terrible tendency of the carbon tax to be politicized. Instead of a pure carbon tax, the political process would rather give it back in rebates, would income. So it's also, regrettably, it's being used as a form of income redistribution. And then, of course, it also tends to not factor in the realities of Canada. For example, the clean fuel standard. We've got some real challenges with the weather here that aren't affected. So efficiency is available, but the way we seem to work now is that there's programs for this. Because they are more attractive politically, that if you install a solar panel on the roof, you can get X, or if you do this, qualify for this insulation program. So it allows the growth of government, and it allows the politicians to sound, dedicated and magnanimous. So efficiency could take care of itself, and it will. I mean, it'll happen. If you look at the fuel economy of automobiles, pretty amazing what they've done in terms of efficiency. The one thing that's not included in anybody's in the push for renewables, electric vehicles, for example.
Right.
What they're not doing is they're not looking at what you might be able to do with the incumbent, which is an ever improving internal combustion engine that got even better mileage yet.
This is a burning question I have, and I know where Eric will know where I'm coming from. You want to comment on nuclear, the fission and or the future of fusion?
It is, where do you put it? It is just probably the most frustrating thing on earth. We can't even clean up the waste. Like, everybody says nuclear is a good idea, and then you go to site it. And then you go to, this is the biggest single challenge. You look at the lead time and you look where you want it. Yeah. So, I guess a lot of line loss from the Northwest Territories where you don't have to ask anybody, find some underpopulated part of the world. So nuclear it works, but in the end, it is almost faddish. After 3 Mile Island, they stopped that nuclear build. After Fukushima, that was when Germany made the decision it's currently regretting. So regrettably, it's politicized as well. These small modular reactors, I have no issues with that. I mean, if you look at the safety record of nuclear power, it's fantastic, really. But I did at one point go down the path of exploring nuclear waste disposal and storage. And that's incredibly political. They tried to, Bruce Power tried to dig a hole in the Precambrian shield, the oldest, most stable rock in the country, not permitted. What happened in the States was they had picked Yucca Mountain just outside of Vegas, and they had spent $7 or $8 billion on tunneling into a mountain to build a secure storage site.
But isn't this a paradox? I mean, we have a technology that is denied social license, which is an answer. I'm not saying it is the answer, but has the capability of offering something that's emissions free. We are seeing the gaining of social license. So I don't think we should take our eyes off the possibility that nuclear may find its way back to the table in the form of SMRs.
I'm all for it. I'm all for any of these things. The point is to do that, we have to say, what are we doing with energy? We're going to fix energy or supply energy. Yeah. And so this goes back to my point about we've taken energy for granted, that it'll always be there. And the various alternatives have been, in my view, oversold. I'm not backing down on that. We're told that all these great things are coming, and they may come, but in the short term, we're a fossil fuel world, and there's a whole bunch. I never even got into the fossil fuel divestment movement and the badge of honor of starving this industry for capital.
Yeah. Well, we may well see the price that the globe is paying and a better appreciation of the relevance of energy on what is going on in the world at large right now in Europe. This whole conversation that you've been just terrific, David, in summarizing the various perspectives of what got us here and what may get us out, particularly the relevance of the third world getting on board. But the consumption of energy worldwide is not declining. The technological answers have not arrived, and those that appear on the horizon are still far away. And the weaponizing of energy in some people's minds seems to be a way to achieve their gains. So we're in a world where this isn't going to go away. And I think as a topic for KEI will continue to be on the table.